This is Professor Bittinger. This short video lecture is going to cover environmental laws and regulations and the history of the environmental movement. The first slide states that environmental laws and regulations can actually discourage or encourage innovation. An environmental regulation is a means of government intervention to reduce environmental degradation, such as water pollution, air pollution, loss of habitat, and biodiversity decline. There are two different approaches that can be used during the regulatory process. One is a command and control approach, which creates regulations that focus primarily on cleanup rather than prevention. There are also incentive-based environmental regulations for companies to innovatively reduce their pollution and the waste that they generate. These types of regulations motivate companies to develop green products and industrial processes that help minimize environmental degradation and also help create jobs. Both these types of approach occur here in the United States, command control as well as incentive-based. The slide in front of you depicts a historical timeline of environmental laws. In 1969, the National Environmental Policy Act was passed. This law is considered to be the granddaddy of all environmental laws. It basically set the stage of how the United States was going to pursue environmental protection. This law created the first federal agency that was set up to oversee environmental protection for the United States, known as the Environmental Protection Agency. It also set forth requirements that any government project that changed the landscape of the land would be required to conduct an environmental impact assessment. The environmental impact assessment was a study done prior to the project being implemented in order to determine if the project would have significant impact on the environment either during the short-term or long-term phase after the project was implemented. This was the first time we had a law that said before you implement a project, first consider what the potential environmental impact would be. In 1970, the Clean Air Act was passed to establish the National Ambient Air Quality Standards for the United States. 6 criteria air pollutants were targeted for being monitored to determine the levels of emissions that were occurring in the United States, as well as setting standards by which companies needed to meet those standards under permits known as Title V Clean Air Act permits. In 1972, the Clean Water Act was passed, and this law focused primarily on any kind of wastewater treatment facility, whether it was municipal wastewater treatment facility or an industrial wastewater treatment facility, to make sure they were treating their sewage properly before discharging the treated wastewater into streams. This was also the same year that DDT was banned in the United States. In 1973, the first law to protect species was passed, known as the Endangered Species Act. This law called for a survey of species populations that seemed to be threatened and in decline. This law also called for protecting the habitats of those species that saw declining populations. In 1974, the Safe Drinking Water Act was passed. This law was established in order to make sure water supply companies were providing safe drinking water to the community for which they serve. It set national water quality standards known as maximum contaminant levels for both primary and secondary drinking water standards. In 1977, the first law at the federal level to manage our waste was passed. It's called the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. This gave the EPA the power to oversee the stipulations and the requirements for landfill design and construction. Prior to 1976, there were no landfill design requirements. Basically, a landfill could simply be a hole in the ground in an area of a community. This law also set forth the requirement for how municipal waste and hazardous waste, as well as nuclear waste and residual waste, was to be handled. from the standpoint of generating the waste, transporting the waste, storing the waste, and disposing of it. In addition, this law gave EPA the power to oversee all hazardous waste management. In 1980, the Superfund law was passed, which focuses on cleaning up old hazardous waste dumps and requiring that those people that polluted the dump were required to pay back the money that was used to clean up the dump. This is also known as CERCLA, C-E-R-C-L-A, the Comprehensive Environmental Response, Compensation, and Liability Act. This law really was passed as a result of a historical environmental event known as the Love Canal, which we'll talk about a little bit in the next slide. This diagram depicts the American environmental movement. There are some key events that happened throughout the 1900s that brought the environmental movement to the forefront. In the late 1960s, acid rain was identified as a major issue in northeastern United States. Studies had been conducted, and the environmental impact of acid rain was quantified and correlated to electrical production and automobile exhaust. As a result of this, the Clean Air Act was passed. In the mid-1970s, the Love Canal protest occurred, and basically citizens within a community were protesting the fact that their local school was built on top of a toxic dump and the kids were getting sick. This Love Canal incident actually led to the Superfund law being passed, otherwise known as CERCLA. In the mid-1980s, the Bhopal chemical spill occurred, which contaminated waterways and was brought into the living room of homes across the globe through TV. In the mid-1980s, we had the Chernobyl nuclear meltdown incident, which is known as one of the largest nuclear meltdowns in the world. And before 1980, actually in 1989, the Exxon Valdez oil spill occurred near Valdez, Alaska. This too was a major event that created a public outcry regarding the fact that the environment needed to be protected. In the mid-1990s, we had our first Earth Summit, where countries came together to meet to discuss sustainability goals as well as climate change. And then later we had the Kyoto Protocol meeting that occurred in the 2000s, right before the year 2000. Looking at the bottom of the graphic, it shows information regarding major legislation that was passed. I'd like to draw your attention to the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, or otherwise known as CITE. This regulation was an international policy that was developed between countries, where countries agreed that there was a necessity to oversee and regulate the trade of species between countries. The other international policies were the Montreal Protocol and the Kyoto Protocol, which happened in the mid-1980s and the mid-1990s. Both of these international agreements were focused on reducing climate change. There is evidence that environmental regulations can work and result in improvement to the environment. Cap and trade approach is one which the government gives and sells companies tradable pollution or resource use permits. Any unused credits can be saved for future expansion, or they can be sold to other companies that need them. Typically, companies that put emissions into the atmosphere have to meet permit requirements. If they fall below those permit requirements and have a little bit of margin, that margin can be used to save for future expansion or sold to other companies that need it. Essentially, this creates a scenario where companies want to perform better than what the permit requires. It actually helps reduce pollution, and resource waste, because companies can create a margin and gain more profit by selling their permit credits that they didn't use up. It also helps reduce the harmful health effects of pollution and also can impact reducing poverty as well. So the cap and trade approach is one which was applied under the Clean Air Act with the coal mining industry. This diagram depicts different advantages and disadvantages for tradable environmental permits. They are flexible and easier to administer. The permit prices to be determined by the market transactions and allows trade of unused credits between companies. Some of the disadvantages that those wealthy companies can ignore the permits requirements and just buy their way out, basically by purchasing credits from other companies that are making technological changes to improve their emissions. Sometimes the caps can be too high and not regularly reduced to promote progress. And also, in all these conditions, these companies self-monitor and report to the state agency and the federal agency regarding their emissions into the atmosphere. This does allow the possibility for someone to report inaccurate records. So, in terms of developing environmental policies, it can be difficult because you can have special interest groups that pressure the governments for subsidy and tax breaks, and as a result, they can even support passage of laws and regulations that are favorable to their cause. We've seen examples of this with the oil and gas industry, where they lobby the lawmakers and request changes to be written into the fine language of the law that favors them. In addition, the lawmakers or politicians may be more concerned with re-election than environmental policies, and therefore write in changes to the law that will get them re-elected as opposed to being beneficial to the environment. This concludes this section of the short video lecture.